Hi guys, thank you for joining me and welcome to another video. This video will introduce you to our new module, Narratives that Shape Our World. So today we will be looking at the following. What is the module? Why will I learn this? What will I learn to do? And what will this look like? Okay, for this video, you will need to have a copy of the rubric. A paper or electronic copy is fine. You'll also need to have some paper, pens, and highlighters as you will need to take notes. Okay, let's get straight into having a look at the rubric. In this module, students explore a range of narratives from the past and the contemporary era that illuminate and convey ideas, attitudes, and values. They consider the powerful role of stories and storytelling as a feature of narrative in past and present societies, as a way of connecting people within and across cultures, communities, and historical eras, inspiring change or consolidating stability, revealing, affirming, or questioning cultural practices, sharing collective or individual experiences, or celebrating aesthetic achievement. Students deepen their understanding of how narrative shapes meaning in a range of modes, media, and forms, and how it influences the way that individuals and communities understand and represent themselves. Students analyze and evaluate one or more print, digital, and/or multimodal text to explore how narratives are shaped by the context and values of composers, authors, poets, playwrights, directors, designers, and so on, and responders alike. They may investigate how narratives can be appropriated, reimagined, or reconceptualized for new audiences. By using narrative in their own composition, students increase their confidence and enjoyment to express personal and public worlds in creative ways. Students investigate how an author's use of textual structures, language, and stylistic features are crafted for particular purposes, audiences, and effects. They examine conventions of narrative, for example, setting, voice, point of view, imagery, and characterization, and analyze how these are used to shape meaning. Students also explore how rhetorical devices enhance the power of narrative in other textual forms, including persuasive texts. They further develop and apply their conventions of syntax, spelling, punctuation, and grammar for specific purposes and effect. Students work individually and collaboratively to evaluate and refine their own use of narrative devices to creatively express complex ideas about their world in a variety of modes for a range of purposes and critically evaluate the use of narrative devices by other composers. All right, so you're probably all thinking, that made absolutely no sense whatsoever, and you didn't understand a large portion of that. And that's okay because this stuff is not really written for you guys. It's written for teachers. And even we spend a lot of time trying to work out what that all means. So I'm not going to take you through every single word and unpack every single part of that. I'm only going to draw attention to the phrases and the ideas and the words that I think are important for you to understand so that you have a clearer understanding of what we're doing and why we're doing it. So firstly, what we're going to look at is what you're going to learn about. What are the big concepts that you need to know? Okay, so let's just stop and think about the title for a minute. Narratives that shape our world. So really you need to think about, well, do narratives shape our world? Have you ever thought about that before? Why do they have narratives instead of narrative? How does meaning change if we write the power of narratives instead of the power of narrative? When we think about the word narrative, what does that actually mean to you? Why is it shaping our world instead of the world? How does the meaning change when we use that pronoun our? And why is it just world and not worlds? Think about those words, and when you think about them in that way, it gives you an idea of what we are going to be looking at. So in this module, you are going to explore a range of narratives from the past and contemporary era. So when we talk about a range, we're talking about 3 or more narratives from the past, so right back from even from the beginning of when people told stories right up until the present day. So think about a narrative that is from the past. Can you think of one that is from the contemporary era? Then we're going to look at how these narratives illuminate and convey ideas, attitudes, and values. So essentially what you can see here is that narratives don't just tell a story. Narratives either communicate to us or they highlight to us specific ideas. They also have embedded in them attitudes towards particular people, towards particular situations. They have attitudes towards particular events. And they also have values. And these are the things that are much harder for us to pick up. So for example, when we think about the story Little Red Riding Hood, it very much has in that story attitudes about what is right and what is wrong. They have values about parents and children. Children should always obey their parents because parents know best. They have values about what a bad guy looks like and what an innocent girl looks like. So they don't just tell us a story. Within that story, they have particular ideas, attitudes, and values. And so when we're looking at specific narratives, we are looking at how these stories convey ideas, attitudes, and values. When you are reading particular stories, are you aware of the ideas or the attitudes or the values that they convey? Now, one of the key aspects of the rubric, of the module description, is the next statement. The powerful role of stories and storytelling as a feature of narrative in past and present societies. So this module is asking you to think about the role of stories. What role, what function do stories have in our society? And it asks you to think a little bit more deeply about how they may have changed from the past. So how might story and storytelling have changed from the past? Think about it originally, why people told stories. When we look at the invention of the story right at the very beginning of humankind, why do people tell stories? And is that role of telling stories the same now, or has it changed? Think about the stories that you know, and think about stories that you know that are from the past and that they keep coming up over time. Is that because that story is powerful? And think about that story and think about, well, why is that story powerful? Why does it keep coming up? How does that story or that narrative shape the way that I think about the world, myself, and other people? Now, at this point, I want to stop and make a distinction in terms of the words that I'm using. So I want you to write some of these notes down, because I want you to write the difference between story and narrative. So when I talk about story, I'm referring to the actual chronology of the events. This sequencing of events creates a sense of control where we take the randomness of events and turn them into an order structure in our minds. Now, when I am referring to narrative, it's a slight distinction here. Narrative is more about the manipulation of that story in how it is presented. So you can have, everyone in our class can have the same order of events, but how you choose to represent those events is your narrative, and your narrative is going to be different to the person next to you. You've all received the same story, but you have presented that story as your own unique narrative. So I think it's important for you to be aware of the distinction between how this module is using the words story and narrative. Okay, so what we now need to do is think about how stories are powerful. So this module is saying to you that the role of stories and storytelling is powerful. And I want you to think about, well, why is that and how are they powerful? And this is what the module suggests. How are stories powerful? Because connect people within and across cultures, communities, and historical eras. So start to think about, how do stories connect people across time and place? Story connects us all. Children, adults, all of us everywhere can use the magic of story to find aspects of ourselves in others and of others in ourselves. Think about how story reminds us that connectedness to the world doesn't always mean that some have more and some have less, but that we all have stories, and that is what brings us together. Think about how you connect with people in your own family because of the stories you share. Consider how you connect with people in different parts of the world because of stories. Even the past, how you can feel connected to people from the past because of stories. That's one role that stories play. Another one is that stories inspire change, or they can also consolidate stability. How can stories inspire change? How can stories reinforce stability? Also, stories reveal, affirm, or question cultural practices. So when we are thinking about stories, think about what cultural practices are revealed. Think about cultural practices that the stories might affirm, which means supports, and there might be some stories where they are questioning cultural practices. So another aspect that this module is showing us, that stories are powerful and have a powerful role because they reveal, affirm, or question cultural practices. Think about how stories allow us to share collective or individual experiences. What collective experiences might we share through story? What about individual experiences? How can stories allow us to share in individual experiences? What is it that's so important to communicate about these experiences? And lastly, in this module, we're going to look at how stories celebrate aesthetic achievement. This is an interesting one because we often don't think about stories in terms of how they are presented to us. We think more about stories and what's in the story. We think about the narrative, we think about the characters and the setting and the tension, the atmosphere, but also part of the role of stories and storytelling is celebrating that aesthetic achievement. So what characteristics do you think a story must have to be able to be valued aesthetically? So when we're thinking about aesthetically, we're thinking about the language and the visual features, how the story has been communicated to us in a way that makes us really enjoy and engage with the story. So we're thinking about imagery, time shifts, rhythm, perspective, juxtaposition, humor, structure, tension and anticipation. So these are all the aspects, and there's obviously a lot more than that, where that's what we think about when we think about the aesthetic achievement. So let's recap. Nessa wants us to consider the powerful role of stories and storytelling as a feature of narrative in past and present societies. Nessa describes the social role of storytelling as being connecting people, inspiring change or consolidating stability, revealing, firming, questioning cultural practices, sharing collective or individual experiences, and celebrating aesthetic achievement. Of all the stories that you know, all the narratives that you are familiar with, which one achieves at least one of those things? And when you think about those stories and narratives, it's usually the ones that hit a lot of those features, those roles, and they're the ones that are quite powerful and seem to be the ones that are retold over time. Okay, so that's what you're going to learn about in Module A. Now let's have a think about why you're going to learn this. Essentially, you're learning this to deepen your understanding of how narratives shape meaning. So how can narrative shape meaning? Name different forms where we find narrative in different modes and media. Write some of those things down. How might narrative in a picture book, film, or feature article differ from narrative in a novel? That's what we mean when we think about shaping. It's how the form and the features create the narrative. So by looking at these ideas about the role of stories and how stories connect us, inspire us, all of those things, it's designed to get you to think more about how narratives shape the meaning. We also want you to deepen your understanding of how narrative influences the way that individuals and communities understand and represent themselves. So through this module, you are going to develop and strengthen your understanding about how people use narrative to represent particular groups or individuals. So think about how can narrative be used to represent individual or group identities. Why might a community want to use narrative as a form of representation? A lot of it is about telling these narratives in order to demonstrate people in a particular way, to convey a particular idea or an attitude or a value about that person or about that group. And we can think of examples of this throughout time of particular individuals and how also these communities, representing of these communities has changed over time. Think about, for example, Ned Kelly and how originally he was represented. He was an outlaw, a scoundrel, good-for-nothing lowlife who stole sheep and did all sorts of other things. But now when the Australians like to talk about Ned Kelly and represent Ned Kelly in terms of movies and narratives and even in art, he's become a hero. So that's the kind of thing that we're looking at. We're looking at how we represent particular people and groups of people in a particular way through the way that we use narrative. Okay, so we've looked at what you're going to learn about. You've looked at why you're going to learn this, and now you're going to look at what you're going to learn to do. That really is about your skills. So you're going to learn to analyze and evaluate texts, to explore how narratives are shaped by the context and values of the composers and responders. Context and values shape narratives. Responders shape values in texts as well. Context is a really key player in the way that it influences the way that a narrative is told, and also the values of the person who's telling that narrative. They will shape that narrative in a particular way because of the things that they value. And when you read or respond to a narrative, you are going to read and respond to that narrative in a particular way based on your context and your own values. So one of the things that you're going to learn to do is to hone that skill of analysing a text and being aware of its context and its values and how those two play a really crucial role in the way that the composer creates the text and how the responder responds to the text. You are also going to learn how to investigate how narratives can be appropriated, reimagined, reconceptualized for new audiences. This is something that's really interesting, and it's a really fun way to look at how and why we tell stories. So let's take a moment to look at these three words: appropriated, reimagined, and reconceptualized in more detail. This will help you to understand more about what these words mean and how we use these words in the English context. So let's look at appropriated. When we use the word appropriated, we are essentially meaning that we take over or possess something for our own personal use. We essentially are lifting the material. Nessa defines it as taking an object or text from one context and using it in another context. The process can allow new insights into the original text, and they can often emphasize contextual differences. Appropriation also gives us extra insight into the newly created or used text. Um, we know that films and novels are often appropriations of earlier texts. This is something that we do all the time, all through history. We appropriate, we take other people's ideas and we reuse them. Let's look at the Cinderella story. Disney did not create Cinderella. Cinderella is an old fairy tale coming from the oral tradition, and Walt Disney has taken that story for his own use, and he has given it a new creation, and he has created that story in that animation form. So he has appropriated the story of Cinderella. He has meddled with the story a little bit, and you may be quite surprised what the original story is like. But essentially, the main aspects of that story haven't changed a lot. Now let's look at the next word, reimagined. When we use the word reimagined, we are thinking about to imagine again or anew. Nessa uses the word essentially in this way: to reinterpret an event, work of art, or a text imaginatively. So that is to reimagine. When we think about the Cinderella story, we can think about it in terms of how it has been reinterpreted over time. Let's look at reconceptualized. This is very similar to reimagining. Reconceptualize is essentially to conceptualize in a new or different way. It is to recreate. Essentially, it's transforming texts to explore how changes in particular elements of a text affect meaning. And that's how Nessa is using it. So when we think about the Cinderella story, we see that it had been reimagined as My Fair Lady, and then it's also been reconceptualized into this fantastic 90s film with Richard Gere and Julia Roberts, Pretty Woman. So this story has been transformed for a new audience. It's the same story. When you think about the chronological sequence of events, but the narrative has been presented to us in a very different way. It has been modernized. The context has been significantly changed and altered, and some of the values and the attitudes have changed subtly to fit for a new audience. So they're the three keywords that we are going to be using in this module, and we are going to be looking at a particular narrative, a particular story, and how that has been appropriated, reimagined, and reconceptualized over time. Some of you may be slightly relieved to find out that it's not Cinderella. We're not looking at Cinderella. We're going to be looking at something far better. Okay, so you've looked at what you're going to learn about in Module A. You've looked at why, and you looked at what what you're going to learn, and really, what is this going to look like? What are you going to be doing? So these are your skills, and remember, often with what we do in English, the emphasis is often on developing your skills as English students, and we change the content, but your skills are what we continue to develop over time. So we are going to investigate. That's one of the skills that you're required and encouraged to develop. And you're going to investigate an author's use of textual structures, language, and stylistic features, and that's essentially building on what you've been doing in Term 1. And as we looked at in Term 1, we looked at how the stories were crafted for particular purposes, audience, and effects, and we're going to continue to do that. You're also going to examine conventions of narratives, and you're going to look at how these are used to shape meaning. So when we talk about conventions of narratives, we are talking about setting, voice, point of view, imagery, characterization. And so we're thinking about how all of these are used to craft the writer's message to their readers or viewers. You're also going to explore how rhetorical devices enhance the power of narrative in other textual forms. So we're not just going to be looking at the narrative, we're also going to be looking at a variety of textual forms like poetry and film. And essentially, by doing all of those three things, investigate, examine, and explore, it's going to allow you to craft your own use of narrative devices to creatively express complex ideas about your world. You're going to experiment with different modes for a range of purposes. And then you're also going to evaluate. You're going to evaluate the use of narrative devices by other composers, and you're going to evaluate your own narrative devices. You're going to evaluate how you have used narrative devices to creatively express your own ideas. And this is all leading to you developing your own narrative text, and that is going to be in the form of a multimodal presentation. So we are continuing to build and develop your skills so that you can produce something at the end of this unit that demonstrates what you have learnt about the power of stories and storytelling, and also what you've learnt to do, how well you can craft your own ideas, and how well you can evaluate what you're doing in order to improve. Okay guys, that's it for this little presentation. I hope you found that helpful, and I hope that has allowed you to have a better understanding of this module and what you can expect. Thank you.